Fair warning, some of these tales may haunt you long after you've heard them. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. Bloodbather. Ben had always known that his family was a little different, but he'd never considered their annual ritual strange until he grew older. On the night before his birthday, his parents would prepare a bath filled with warm, crimson liquid. His mother would lead him to the bathroom, her face an unreadable mask, and his father would test the temperature, always ensuring it was just right. Ben would submerge himself without complaint, the thick, warm liquid clinging to his skin. His parents were meticulous, scrubbing this substance into his arms, his chest, and even his hair. Once finished, he would sit on the bathroom floor, sticky as the blood dried and tightened on his skin. Then his parents would hug him, kiss him on the forehead, and send him to bed. His birthdays always followed the same pattern. A shower to wash away the red, a cheerful breakfast, and then the typical festivities, cake, presents, and laughter. But as he grew older, the ritual weighed heavier on his mind. It was when he was 10 years old that Ben first realized other families didn't share this peculiar tradition. His friend Jimmy's horrified reaction after Ben casually mentioned his blood bath started a chain reaction of whispers and rumors. When Jimmy's parents called Ben's home, furious and bewildered, his father sat him down for a serious talk. "Ben," his father had said, his voice firm, "you must never speak about this again. It's not something others will understand. It's something we do to protect you." Protect him from what? Ben hadn't dared to ask. By the time Ben turned 16, he had stopped being the compliant son his parents knew. Rebellion came naturally to him now. Sneaking out, staying out late, and challenging every rule his parents imposed. When the eve of his 16th birthday arrived, his mother knocked softly on his door. "Ben, it's time for your bath." "I'm not doing it," Ben said, barely looking up from his phone. "Ben, please don't do this," she said, her voice trembling. No, he folded his arms and glared at her. His father appeared minutes later, the weariness in his face replaced with raw anger. "This isn't up for debate, Ben. You will take that bath." Ben pushed past him, storming out of the house. The cool night air stung his skin, but he welcomed it, relishing his small rebellion. He ran to the edge of their neighborhood, the thrill of defiance fueling him, until the pain began. It started as a strange tingling in his fingers, then spread to his arms. He looked down, horrified to see his skin blistering and cracking, deep red fissures exposing raw, oozing flesh beneath. He screamed in agony, collapsing to the pavement. By the time his father found him, Ben's arms were barely recognizable, the skin hanging in shredded tatters. His father scooped him up without a word and rushed him back home. The moment Ben's broken body hit the warm blood, the pain stopped. His skin began to knit itself back together, the blisters vanishing before his eyes. "Do you understand now?" his father whispered, his face pale with fear. "You need this to live, Ben." Years passed, and Ben never resisted the baths again. The routine became a grim necessity, a shadow over his otherwise mundane life. But on the eve of his 25th birthday, his father sat him down, his hands shaking as he held a glass of whiskey. "Ben," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of years, "it's time you knew the truth." His father explained how, late in his mother's pregnancy, Ben had been gravely ill. The doctors had said there was nothing they could do. That's when a man, no, a creature, appeared, offering salvation. "He said he could save you," his father murmured. "He promised you'd live, but only if we upheld our end of the deal." "The baths are part of that deal." Ben felt his stomach churn. "What's in the bath?" "Blood," his father admitted. "The blood of others. It keeps you alive. Without it, your body will decay." Ben recoiled, horror washing over him. "Whose blood?" His father didn't answer, but the haunted look in his eyes told Ben everything he needed to know. On the night of his father's death, Ben stood alone in the bathroom, staring at the empty tub. The blisters had already started forming on his hands, the pain spreading faster than ever before. His father's final words echoed in his mind. "When I'm gone, it'll be up to you to fill the tub." Ben clenched his fists, his bloody knuckles trembling. He'd tried everything in the months leading up to this moment, researching curses, consulting healers, even testing his resolve to endure the pain without the bath. But nothing worked. The agony was unbearable, and the decay would only worsen. Desperation clawed at him. He thought of his neighbors, his friends, anyone who wouldn't be missed. He returned home hours later, dragging a heavy sack into the bathroom. Blood dripped from the edges, pooling at his feet. His hands shook as he poured the crimson contents into the tub. Ben lowered himself into the bath, the warm liquid soothing his blistered skin. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. The blood began to ripple, the surface bubbling like boiling water. Then the shadows in the room seemed to shift, pooling together in the corner. A figure emerged, its golden eyes glowing with malevolent glee. "Did you think this would end with him?" The figure hissed, its voice deep and guttural. "The debt is eternal." Before Ben could react, the blood began to rise, tendrils of crimson liquid wrapping around his body. He struggled, thrashing as the tendrils tightened, dragging him deeper. His screams were swallowed by the bubbling surface, his vision blurring as the blood filled his lungs. When the room stilled, the tub was empty. No blood, no Ben. In a small hospital miles away, a newborn baby cried out, frail and struggling to breathe. The parents huddled together, their faces pale with worry. A man appeared in the doorway, his smile too wide, his golden eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I can help," he said. The smiling man. About 5 years ago, I lived in the heart of a major U.S. city, a bustling place that transformed into a quiet, shadowy world at night. I've always been a night owl, someone who feels more alive when the rest of the world is asleep. My roommate, the polar opposite, had a strict bedtime and could never understand my late-night wanderings. When he'd go to sleep, I'd lace up my shoes, step out into the cool night air, and walk. Not for any particular reason, but to think, to clear my head. For 4 years, I wandered those streets at night, always feeling safe. The city felt like mine in those hours, silent and unthreatening. I often joked with my roommate that the place was so mellow. Even the drug dealers were polite. But one night changed everything. It was a Wednesday. I remember that clearly because the night was unusually still, even for a weekday. The city seemed deserted. I had wandered farther from my apartment than usual, strolling through a police-patrolled park that was eerily empty. The lamplights cast long, thin shadows on the pavement, the occasional rustle of leaves the only sound. I decided to take a shortcut, turning down a narrow side street to start heading home. It was then that I saw him. At the far end of the street, silhouetted under a flickering streetlight, a man was dancing. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no, he was moving with deliberate, almost rhythmic grace. His steps formed what looked like a waltz, but after every motion, he took an exaggerated forward stride. It was bizarre, almost hypnotic. He was coming toward me. I slowed my pace, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The man was tall, lanky, and dressed in an old suit that hung awkwardly on his frame. The closer he got, the more I realized how deliberate his movements were. They weren't the stumbles of a drunk person. They were precise. Unease prickled at the back of my neck, but I told myself he was probably just eccentric, harmless. To give him space, I stepped closer to the curb, leaving him most of the sidewalk. That's when I saw his face. His head was tilted slightly back, his eyes wide and staring. Not at me, but up at the sky. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, impossibly wide, as if frozen in a caricature of joy. That smile, it wasn't normal. It didn't feel human. My heart quickened. Without thinking, I crossed the empty street, putting as much distance as I could between us. I kept my eyes on him as I moved, hoping he'd just pass by. But as I reached the other side, I stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing. He was standing perfectly still now, one foot in the street, the other on the sidewalk, his body turned to face me. His head remained tilted skyward, that awful smile plastered on his face. A wave of fear washed over me. I took a step backward, then another. My instinct screamed at me to keep moving, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. I forced myself to turn and walk, quickening my pace. After putting about half a block between us, I glanced over my shoulder. He was gone. Relief hit me like a breath of fresh air, but it lasted only a moment, because then I saw him again. He had crossed the street and was crouched low in the shadows, his lanky frame bent unnaturally. Even from a distance, I could feel his gaze. He was watching me. My stomach knotted. I hadn't looked away for more than 10 seconds. How had he moved so fast? I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. Should I run? Scream? Call someone? But before I could decide, he began to move again. Music grows faster, an unsettling rhythm. This time, he wasn't dancing. He was sneaking, taking long, exaggerated tiptoed steps like a cartoon character creeping up on someone. His movements were almost comical if they hadn't been so terrifying. But he was fast, too fast. My legs finally obeyed me, and I backed away, heart pounding. But then he stopped again, just a car length away. He stood there, perfectly still, his grin unbroken, his eyes still fixed on the sky. I tried to speak, to demand what he wanted, but all that came out was a trembling. What the F? He didn't react. He didn't move. He just stood there, smiling that awful smile. And then, just as slowly as he had stopped, he turned. He began to dance-walk away, his movements as fluid and deliberate as before, as though I no longer existed. I stayed rooted to the spot, watching him retreat. My muscles screamed at me to move, to get away, but I couldn't turn my back on him. Finally, when he was almost out of sight, I started to breathe again. But that's when I noticed something. He wasn't dancing anymore, and he wasn't walking away. He was running, straight toward me. Panic exploded in my chest, and I ran. I ran harder and faster than I ever had, the sound of my own footsteps pounding in my ears. The streetlights blurred past me, the shadows stretching and twisting as I sprinted back toward the main road. When I finally reached the brighter, busier street, I stopped and looked back. He was gone. I scanned the darkness, half expecting to see that grin emerge from the shadows. But the street was empty. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I was inside, the door locked securely behind me. That was the last night I ever went walking alone. For the remaining 6 months I lived in that city, I couldn't bring myself to step outside after dark. Even now, years later, I can't forget his face. His eyes, his grin, it wasn't the look of someone drunk or high. It was something far worse. It was the look of someone utterly unhinged, completely detached from reality. And that's the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. Balloons. When I was 5 years old, I went to an elementary school that, from what I've come to understand, was really adamant about the importance of learning through activity. It was part of a new program designed to allow children to rise at their own pace. And to facilitate this, the school encouraged teachers to come up with really inventive lesson plans. Each teacher was given the latitude to create his or her own themes which would run for the duration of the grade. And all the lessons in math, reading, etc. would be designed in the spirit of the theme. These themes were called groups. There was a space group, a sea group, an earth group, and the group I was in, community. In kindergarten in this country, you don't learn much except how to tie your shoes and how to share. So most of it isn't very memorable. I only remember 2 things very clearly. I was the best at writing my name the right way, and the balloon project, which was really the hallmark of the community group, since it was a pretty clever way to show how a community functioned at a really basic level. You probably heard of this activity. On one Friday, I remember it being Friday because I was excited about the project and it being the end of the week. Toward the beginning of the year, We walked into the classroom in the morning and saw that there was a fully inflated balloon tied off with string taped to each of our desks. Sitting on each of our desks was a marker, a pen, a piece of paper, and an envelope. The project was to write a note on the paper, put it in the envelope, and attach it to the balloon, which we could draw a picture on if we wanted. Most of the kids started fighting over the balloons because they wanted different colors, but I started on my note, which I thought a lot about. All the notes had to follow a loose structure, but we were allowed to be creative within those boundaries. My note was something like this: "Hi, you found my balloon. My name is name, and I attend underscore 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 elementary school. You can keep the balloon, but I hope you write me back. I like Mighty Max, exploring, building forts, swimming, and friends. What do you like? Write me back soon. Here's $1 for the mail." On the dollar I wrote, "for stamps," right across the front, which my mom said was unnecessary, but I thought it was genius, so I did it. The teacher took a Polaroid of each of us with our balloons and had us put them in the envelope along with our letter. They also included another letter that I assume explained the nature of the project and sincere appreciation for anyone's participation in writing back and sending photos of their city or neighborhood. That was the whole idea, to build a sense of community without having to leave the school and to establish safe contact with other people. It seemed like such a fun idea. Over the next couple weeks, the letters started to roll in. Most came with pictures of different landmarks, and each time a letter would come in, the teacher would pin the picture on a big wall map we had put up showing where the letter had come from and how far the balloon had traveled. It was a really smart idea because we actually looked forward to coming to school to see if we had gotten our letter. For the duration of the year, we had one day a week where we could write back to our pen pal or another student's pen pal in case our letter hadn't come in yet. Mine was one of the last to arrive. When I came into the classroom, I looked at my desk and once again didn't see any letter waiting for me. But as I sat down, the teacher approached me and handed me an envelope. I must have looked so excited because as I was about to open it, she put her hand on mine to stop me and said, "Please don't be upset." I didn't understand what she meant. Why would I be upset now that my letter had come? Initially, I was mystified that she would even know what was in the envelope. But now I realized that of course the teachers had screened the contents to make sure there was nothing obscene. But all the same, how could I be disappointed? When I opened the envelope, I understood. There was no letter. The only thing in the envelope was a Polaroid, but I couldn't really make out what it was. It looked like a patch of desert, but it was too blurry to decipher. It appeared as if the camera had been moved while the picture was being taken. There was no return address, so I couldn't even write back if I wanted to. I was crushed. The school year pressed on, and the letters had stopped coming for nearly all of the other students. After all, you can only continue a written correspondence with a kindergartner for so long. Everyone, including myself, had lost interest in the letters almost completely. Then I got another envelope. My excitement was rejuvenated, and I reveled in the fact that I was still getting a letter when most of the other pen pals had abandoned their involvement. It made sense that I received another delivery. There had been nothing but a blurry picture in the first one, so this was probably to make up for that. But again, there was no letter at all, just another picture. This one was more distinguishable, but I still didn't understand it. The photograph was angled way up, catching the top corner of a building, and the rest of the image was distorted by a lens flare from the sun. Because the balloons didn't travel very far, and because they were all launched on the same day, the board became a bit cluttered, and so the policy for the students still exchanging letters became that they could take the photographs home. My best friend Josh had the second highest number of pictures taken home by the end of the year. His pen pal was really cooperative and sent him pictures from all around the neighboring city. Josh took home, I think, for pictures. I took home nearly 50. The envelopes were all opened by the teacher, but after a while I stopped even looking at the pictures. However, I saved them in one of my drawers that housed my collections of rocks, baseball cards, comic book cards, Marvel metal cards for those who might remember, and little miniature baseball batting helmets that I'd get out of a vending machine at Winixie after T-ball games. With the school year over, my attention turned to other things. My mom had gotten me a small snow cone machine for Christmas that year, and Josh had really coveted it. So much so that his parents bought him a slightly nicer one for his birthday, which was toward the end of the school year. That summer we had the idea that we would set up a snow cone stand to make money. We thought we'd make a fortune selling snow cones at $1. Josh lived in a different neighborhood, but we eventually decided that my neighborhood would be better because there were a lot of people who cared for their lawns. The yards in my neighborhood were slightly bigger. We did this for 5 weekends in a row until my mom told us that we had to stop, and I've only recently come to understand why she did that. On the 5th weekend, Josh and I were counting our money. Because we both had a machine, we each had a separate stack of money that we put together into one stack, and we then split it evenly. We had made a total of $16 that day, and as Josh paid out my 5th dollar, a feeling of profound surprise consumed me. The dollar said, for stamps. Josh noticed my shock and asked if he had miscounted. I told him about the dollar, and he said, "That's so cool, man." As I thought about it, I came to agree. The idea that the dollar had made it right back to me after changing so many hands floored me. I rushed inside to tell my mom, but my excitement, coupled with her being distracted by a phone call, made my story incomprehensible, and she responded simply by saying, "Oh wow, that's neat." Frustrated, I ran back outside and told Josh I had something to show him. Back in my room, I opened the drawer and took out the stack of envelopes and showed him some of the pictures. I started with the first picture, and we went through about 10 before Josh lost interest and asked if I wanted to go play in the ditch, a dirt ditch down the street from my house, before his mom came to pick him up, so that's what we did. We had a dirt war for a while, but it was interrupted several times by rustling in the woods around us. There were raccoons and stray cats that lived in there, but this was making a little too much noise, and we traded guesses at what it was in an attempt to scare each other. My last guess was that it was a mummy, but in the end Josh kept insisting that it was a robot because of the sounds that we heard. Before we left, he got a little serious and looked me right in the eyes and said, "You heard it, didn't you? It sounded like a robot. You heard it too, right?" I had heard it, and since it sounded mechanical, I agreed that it was probably a robot. It's only now that I understand what we heard. When we got back, Josh's mom was waiting for him at the kitchen table with my mom. Josh told his mom about the robot. Our moms laughed and Josh went home. My mom and I ate dinner, and then I went to bed. I didn't stay in bed for long before I crept out and decided that, due to the day's events, I would revisit the envelope since now the whole affair seemed much more interesting. I took the first envelope and set it on the floor and set the blurry desert Polaroid on top. I laid the second envelope right next to it and placed the oddly angled Polaroid of a building's top corner on top, and did this with each picture until they formed a grid that was about 5 by 10. I was always taught to be careful with things that I was collecting even if I wasn't sure they were valuable. I noticed that the pictures gradually became more decipherable. There was a tree with a bird on it, a speed limit sign, power line, a group of people walking into some building. And then I saw something that vexed me so powerfully that I can now, as I write this, distinctly remember feeling dizzy and capable of only a single, repeating thought. Why am I in this picture? In this photograph of the group of people entering the building, I saw myself holding hands with my mother in the very back of the crowd of people. We were at the very edge of the photo, but it was undeniably us. And as my eyes swam over the sea of Polaroids, I became increasing anxious. It was a really odd feeling. It wasn't fear, it was the feeling you get when you are in trouble. I'm not sure why I was flooded with that feeling, but there I sat floundering in the distinct sense that I had done something wrong. And this feeling only intensified as I looked on at the rest of the photos after that, the one that had so powerfully struck me. I was in every photo. None of them were close shots. None of them were only of me. But I was in every single one of them, off to the side, in the back, bottom of the frame. Some of them only had the tiniest part of my face captured at the very edge of the photo. But nevertheless, I was there. I was always there. I didn't know what to do. Your mind works in funny ways as a kid, but there was a large part of me that was afraid of getting in trouble simply for still being up. Since I already had the looming feeling of having done something wrong, I decided that I would wait until tomorrow. The next day, my mom was off work and spent most of the morning cleaning up around the house. I watched cartoons, I imagine, and waited until I thought it was a good time to show her the Polaroids. When she went out to get the mail, I grabbed a couple of the pictures and put them on the table in front of me as I sat waiting for her to come back in. When returned, she was already opening the mail and threw some junk mail into the trash can, and I said, "Mom, can you come here for a second? I have these pictures. Just give me a minute, honey. I need to mark these on the calendar." After a minute or two, she came and stood behind me and asked me what I needed. I could hear her shuffling with the mail behind me, but I just looked at the Polaroids and told her about them. As I explained more and pointed to the pictures, her frequent ahs and okays decreased, and she was suddenly completely quiet and only making a little noise with the mail. The next noise I heard from her sounded as if she was trying to catch her breath in a room that had no air left in it. At last her struggling gasps were conquered, and she simply dropped the remaining mail on the table and ran to the kitchen to get the phone. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't know about these. Don't be mad at me." With the phone pressed to her ear, she was walking/running back and forth and shouting into it. I nervously fiddled with the mail sitting next to my Polaroids. The top envelope had something sticking out of it that I thoughtlessly and anxiously pulled on until it came out. It was another Polaroid. Confused, I thought that somehow one of my Polaroids had slipped into the stack when she threw the mail down, but when I turned it over and looked at it, I realized that I had not seen this one before. To my dismay, it was me, but this one was a much closer shot. I was surrounded by trees and was smiling. But it wasn't just me, I noticed. Josh was there too. This was us from yesterday. I started yelling for my mom, who was still screaming into the phone. I repeatedly yelled for her until she finally responded with, "What?" And I could only think to ask, "Who are you calling?" "I'm talking with the police, honey." "But why?" "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do anything." She answered me with a response that I never understood until I was forced to revisit these events from the earliest years of my life. She grabbed the envelope off the table and the picture of Josh, and I spun and slid, landing next to the other Polaroids in front of me. She held the envelope up to my eyes, but I could only look at her and watch as all the color began draining out of her face. With tears welling up in her eyes, she said that she had to call the police because there was no postmark. Plot holes. The day I found my first hole was the day my best friend came back from the dead. We were in high school and stupid. Jake was his name, and we liked to go out to this old abandoned house in the woods after school to just screw around, do stupid teenage things. It was a pretty big place, to be honest. 2-story house with a basement, or 3 stories if you counted the small attic above it. The story is supposed to go that an old woman was building the house years and years ago in order to get away from the city life, but for some reason never finished it. Probably died. Anyway, the house was pretty close to completion when she stopped, but nobody bothered to finish it, and now it just sits there rotting away. So Jake and I would go to the house and just screw around, scaring each other or exploring the place. Whatever we felt like. Usually we were careful or lucky, but nothing ever happened to make us worry. Then the floorboards broke under Jake's feet when we were exploring the second floor, and he fell. I never realized how bad the condition of the house must have been because when he hit the first floor, that broke too, and he fell into the basement. I ran down and looked through the broken hole in the first floor. It was dark, but we usually had the foresight to bring flashlights, so I shined a light on him. I'll never forget what I saw. One of the boards or something must have fallen at just the right angle that when Jake hit the ground, it speared up right through his stomach. I could see him shift and try to grab at it, even hear him gurgle. And then he stopped. He was dead. I was sure of it. Our stupidity got him killed. I was in shock. I didn't know what to do. So I just ran. I ran out of the house and left him there. It was about evening when I got home, and I went straight to my room. I didn't talk to anyone, didn't stop for anything. I just wanted to curl up and try to forget that scene. My parents tried to talk to me, but I feigned sleep, and they just went on. Later that night, we got a call from Jake's parents asking where he was. They actually woke me up for that one, and I said I had no idea. The usual, well, if you see him, please let us know, came afterward, and I just nodded before I went back to sleep. The next day was school, and I went through the morning ritual in a bit of a trance. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't stay home. I was pretty sure Jake's parents already suspected something of me. So I went. School was just like usual. People screwing around in the morning and talking. I went up to my normal group of friends that I hung out with before the first bell rang, and my heart stopped. There was Jake. He stood there, just laughing and being his normal self. When he saw me, he looked over and grinned before coming over. He made a joke, but I didn't hear it. I just continued to stare. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, starting to get concerned. Are you okay?" was all I could muster back. "Well, yeah. Why wouldn't I be?" He laughed a bit, but gave me a weird look. You don't know anything?" I tried to phrase it as delicately as possible. I didn't want anyone else knowing, but I figured that was enough to clue him in. If it did, he didn't show it. "Know anything of what?" He responded, and then the bell rang. He said bye and gave me a weird look before heading off to class. I just stared after in shock. Why was my friend here? I saw him die. At the very least, he should be in the hospital, but he was fine. I went to class, but I couldn't concentrate. I just kept thinking about Jake and how he should be dead. I kept trying to think of how he could have survived, but I just couldn't fill this strange hole of a mystery. After class, I decided I'd check out the house. Jake met me after school and asked if I still wanted to hang out. I told him I wasn't feeling well and we'd catch up tomorrow. He seemed to accept that and move off. It's not like I wasn't excited my friend was back, but looking at him made something in me cringe. He shouldn't be alive. He should not be here. I saw him, so I went to the house that afternoon alone. When I walked in, I could feel something. It was strange but familiar. It was the same feeling I got when I looked at Jake, that something wasn't right and it was just off. However, here it felt like a lingering feeling. Not this fresh, what the hell, I got when I saw my friend. I stepped forward and looked down. Sure enough, there was the damn hole he fell through. I let out a sigh of relief and bent over. So I wasn't crazy. I slipped out my usual flashlight and shone it down into the hole. Yes, there was the wreck I saw him land on. Just no Jake. Did he get free? Did he magically regenerate or something? I shone my flashlight up to look toward the hole in the second floor. It wasn't there. My breath caught in my throat, and I began to frantically shine my light onto the ceiling. Where was it? I should be right above the damn hole in the floor, but nothing. I bolted up the stairs and, sure enough, there was nothing in the floor where he fell. Nothing. Something was wrong. Really wrong. I wandered back down to the first hole and peeked down into it. I'm sure that was the moment that solidified my fate. If I had just ignored it, moved on, and been plain happy that my friend was back, I might have been able to continue life as usual. But that moment, I saw something, just a flash of something black, blacker than the darkness beyond my flashlight's range shift and fly out of sight. I gasped and stumbled back, breathing heavily. I know I should have run, but my curiosity took hold, and my logical side said it was just some animal or trick of the light. So I swallowed my fear, and I leaned over to peek again. I didn't see that flash of black again, but I did notice something. The boards and wreckage underneath the hole were gone. With that note, I knew something was wrong. Nobody can clean up something like that mess in the blink of an eye. I bolted. I ran out of that house and through the forest, swearing up and down that something was chasing me. I had a feeling that there was something out there, but now I know it was simply watching me. For now. I ran home and slammed the door shut behind me before I leapt into my bed. My body curled up and I just lay there, trying to comprehend what was going on. It took me a while, but I finally drew myself out of bed. I had to figure out what was going on, but like hell I was going back to that damn house. Not as some monster was in it. So, I did what any teenager would do. I went to the internet and researched. It was slow, and I didn't have a lot of luck at first. Looking up paranormal just got me weird pictures and stories. Friend Comes Back from Dead got me a lot of zombie stuff. Missing Time seemed to give me a little more info. A lot of it was around aliens, but a few stories seemed to pique my interest. Like something crazy seeming to happen, like a car crash or accident. And suddenly, there's a time jump and things seem to be okay. Like nothing ever happened. There was one post on a missing time board that seemed to draw my attention. However, it was titled Plot Holes and was only posted a couple of days ago. I curiously clicked it. Everyone seemed to speculate what caused this whole missing time thing. A lot of the time it was aliens or dimensional. Whatever, this guy, however, acted like he knew for a fact. And his reason was the most bizarre of them all. He started by telling a similar story. In a nutshell, his wife was killed in a household accident when part of their house caved in during a storm. While trying to get to her, he was knocked out by some other debris. When he came to, he was sitting in the living room and his wife was trying to wake him up. The house was fine, with no sign of disaster, and she was alive. He was ecstatic, but described a strange feeling. Like he had figured out something he shouldn't have, and that his wife shouldn't be there. Like my feeling I got with Jake. Over time, he couldn't be around her. It just was too strange. So he left. He went on the road, taking what money he had and doing weird little jobs here and then while staying in motels. While he went, he began to research. It took a great amount of time, but he found others with similar experiences. Most of them just described it as a miracle and moved on with their lives. Others couldn't shake the feeling, like he did. All of them described the same sort of thing. Some event should have caused something to happen, a person to die, or some landmark to be destroyed, only to have it miraculously come back later. So, what was going on? The author was at a standstill until he came across something. While researching people who shouldn't be alive, he came across a book review. Apparently, it was the latest book in the series, and in it, a side character saves the day by fighting off a bunch of enemies for the heroes. However, in the previous book by a different author, that character had been killed. So, this character couldn't have come back to save the day, but if he didn't, the main characters would have died. The reviewer said it was one of the worst plot holes he'd ever seen. That got the forum author and me thinking. He said he'd post again after he experimented a bit, and I didn't blame him. I had a few things I wanted to experiment with as well. Nevertheless, I dropped him a message saying I read his post, and that something similar happened to me. Then called it a night early. I had to be extremely alert if I was going to try to look for the signs I wanted to find. The next morning, I woke up and started my first attempt at looking for plot holes. I know how crazy that sounded, but something seemed to click after reading that review. Someone should have died, but that was ignored so he could do something of significance later. It sounded so familiar. The first few days, I didn't notice anything, except for that weird feeling around Jake. Nobody else seemed to have it. The third day was when I noticed my first plot hole. It was minor, the most minor of details, but it was there. One of the girls in my class went from wearing a skirt to a set of jeans between periods. I know how that seems to make me look, but I'll admit it, the skirt was why I noticed. But to change into a pair of jeans within 7 minutes while walking across campus to another class, that doesn't make sense. I guessed it was possible, but it didn't make sense. It was like a costume got wrong during a scene change. After that, it went all downhill. I kept seeing changes everywhere. A sign would be black in the morning, but light green later at night, or a friend would go from wearing a sweater to a t-shirt when I looked away from a moment. You'd think that people would notice these changes, but nobody did. Maybe it was the strange feeling that I got of something being off after the accident with Jake, or perhaps you just had to be looking for them. But as I kept looking, they were everywhere. It was about a week and a half before I got a response back from the plot holes author. He introduced himself as Dennis and apologized for being late to respond. His reason why? He had gotten caught up in observing plot holes. He was noticing the same thing I was. This is the first time I've ever actually spoken to this guy, but the changes he described matched mine to a T. Except for one thing. After noticing a misspelled sign above a store late at night, he turned away for a moment to look back and saw a shadowy black figure floating by it. It was hazy, like looking at the figure through a fog that just wasn't there, but after the being floated away, the spelling error was gone. A shiver went down my spine. That seemed too close to whatever I might have glimpsed at the house. I hadn't seen it full on yet, but then now I knew what I was looking for. I wish I hadn't. It wasn't long before I began to see them. You had to look at just the right moment, I found out. When it seemed like nobody was watching or paying attention to that little error you just noticed. Then you could make it out. A shadowy haze of a being, seeming to be dressed in a long black robe with a hood, messing with it until it changed. I saw one fade my friend's t-shirt into a jacket/shirt set on a cold day in class. And I saw another change an entire stack of books at the library into a completely different set before they were picked up by a student. Nobody noticed them, just like the holes. It was like you had to be on that wavelength to notice. I've been conversing with Dennis a bit online, and he agreed with that idea. It seemed that you had to notice one to start seeing the others. If you could brush it off, then your life would go on. But if you were the curious sort, then you were like the two of us. You just keep seeing them all the time. I was starting to go crazy. I couldn't say anything to anyone, and Jake kept bothering me about why we never hung out anymore. I just couldn't look at him. He wasn't natural, but I realized it wasn't him. It was those things that brought him back. Maybe he had some destiny or something, but I had no idea. Things took another turn when I was having a Skype conversation with Dennis. He asked if they noticed me yet. I told him no, and then he got quiet for a long time. After some bugging, he finally responded and told me one of his friends that was helping him look into this occurrence was gone. Nobody even seemed to remember his existence. When he went over to his friend's house, Dennis found it relatively neat save for a few items strewn about. As he explored, the belongings that were out of place began to find themselves back in their positions. Dennis was sure that it was one of those creatures behind it, and he confirmed his suspicions when he saw one putting back a book that had been thrown on the floor, and then turn and look at him. The two stared for a long time, the creature gazing onto Dennis while he looked into a blank nothingness that was its face, the dark covering whatever might have lurked underneath. And then it left. It turned and seemed to float away right through one of the walls. That seemed to be the last thing out of place then. The house looked like nothing had ever happened in it. Then Dennis began to notice something else. There were no pictures or objects identifying an owner. Unless you were that much of a hermit, you had at least an old family picture of some parents or something. Or maybe some mail with your name on it. But nothing. It was like nobody had ever lived in this fully furnished home. At this point, I began to worry. Dennis's friend had gone missing, and nobody knew of his existence. I started putting the pieces together then. If these creatures could bring someone back from the dead, they could easily get rid of someone, right? This meant I was in danger. After that, I stopped. I was out. I ignored Dennis's messages. I tried to ignore all the holes I constantly noticed. I did my best to ignore those shadow creatures when I caught them. I even tried to hang back out with Jake. But every time we hung together, it was like I was looking at the face of a lie. And looking at him just made me think of those creatures. I imagined one pulling him up from that debris, slipping that board through and out his body, knitting up his wounds like nothing happened. I did my best to look past it all. Dennis was hard to ignore, however. He just kept tracking me down. I'd block him from my email and messengers, but he'd start making new accounts to talk to send me more messages. And he seemed to be sending more and more as the days went on. Finally, one day, I received an email from a new account that clearly was Dennis. I was about to delete it and block him again, but the subject chilled me to the bone. They're after me. Get on Skype. I need help. I didn't know what to do. If Dennis was in trouble from these things, then I had to help. I couldn't just leave him. But after him, they might turn their sights on me. I had to help. I wasn't going to just leave him hanging, especially if he was in danger. I logged on to Skype, added his new account, and immediately got a video chat request. Dennis was in his apartment with the lights off, and he looked terrified. What's going on? I asked as I leaned in. They've been following me around. He spoke, his voice an exasperated whisper. More and more of them keep coming around, and not just to fill in the holes. They're watching me. Are you sure? In response, he lifts up his laptop and carried it out to what looked to be the kitchen. He set it down in front of a window and drew back the curtain. I couldn't make it out anything until he turned on the light. My heart stopped. I'd only seen one of them at a time. Maybe even two if something was a particularly big change. But there were at least 3 or 4 behind that window, just staring in with those empty, hooded faces. He quickly flicked off the light and turned the laptop back toward him. Do you see? I don't know what to do. I don't want to end up like Jerry. Tell me what to do. He was getting more and more anxious. I had no idea what to tell him. I didn't know what these things were. I didn't know what they wanted, or how to stop them. I opened my mouth but couldn't form the words that he needed to hear. And as I stammered to find out what to say, I saw them slip into the background behind him, through a freaking wall, with a cabinet. Dennis! I yelled. Behind you! He turned just as the first approached. God, there were a bunch slipping in now. 3, then 4, then 5. He never stood a chance. The first reached forward with an inky arm and shoved it straight through his chest. There wasn't any blood, or even a sound save for Dennis's terrified scream. He began to writhe, grasping at his chest as the creature held him thereby. I don't even know what. His spine? His heart? Hell, it could have been his very soul for all I know. Then the others were on top of him. They fell onto him like a dark dog pile, consuming him in their dark presences. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. I just watched as he faded from view as those creatures piled onto him. Then, slowly, ever so slowly, they backed away. Dennis was gone. I bit back tears as I saw the empty space he had been in. I knew what had happened. He was gone. Erased. Nobody would even remember him. He was a hole that had to be filled in and taken care of. Then their attention turned to the computer. To me. My eyes widened as realization hit me. I was another hole. I was an issue in their grand scheme, a thorn that had to be plucked, a part that drew attention to the inaccuracies of this world they were trying to design, and I had to be taken care of. I didn't even bother to turn off the computer. I just stood and turned only to find myself face to face with a horde of them, in my own house, in my own room. My back went to my desk as one shadowy shade glided to me. Its arm rose, and I could almost make out the tendrils of its foggy black cloak and the individual digits of its dark fingers. I couldn't move. I was frozen, and then it struck. I didn't physically feel the hand shove into my chest, but I felt it somewhere deeper, like it was grabbing an intimate part of my being. I felt violated, exposed, and most of all, completely terrified. I screamed as it began to squeeze. It hurt. It hurt so fucking much. My vision blurred, but I could see the others move around me. They filled in a circle around my body, regardless if there was something in their way or not. They just glided through like those things weren't there. And then they fell upon me. Black hit me from every side. I screamed, but no sound came out. I could feel that hand wrenching back, pulling something so personal to me away. My body felt limp then. I started to feel nothing. It inched along my limbs slowly, turning feeling of cold pain, terror into absolute nothing. I could only describe it as a feeling of being erased. There was feeling, strong feeling, and then nothing. It slowly inched along, riding up along my arms and legs until it consumed my whole being. The pain faded along with it, along with the sounds of the world and my vision before me. Soon, nothing was before me but pure blackness. I was gone. I knew it. I was dead. Or worse, I didn't exist any longer. Stretched out before me was nothing but darkness. I tried to call out into the void, to claw my way forward, but I couldn't move a limb. More like though, I didn't have a limb to move or a mouth to yell. I was just an essence, a leftover floating in an endless void of nothing. I'm still there, in pure nothingness. I can't move, or I don't think I have anything left to move. It's gone. Every part of me is gone. I wonder what happens now. I wonder what Jake's destiny was. I also began to wonder if this was death, or something worse. A punishment for sticking my nose in places it shouldn't be. Is this death, or pure erasure? I'm sure Dennis is feeling the same things I'm feeling. I can almost imagine him too, floating in the same void. Maybe one day we'll meet each other. It's a hope that I try to keep alive. It keeps me sane that I might one day not be alone here. That's the end of my story. I wish it was better. I wish I could say I fought back and saved myself. At least that I was on the run. But some plots don't have happy endings. However, I'm sure I've left you wondering one final thing. If I'm dead or erased, then how could I have written this? Well, my poor friend, you've just discovered your first plot hole. Be wary if you see any more. Stuck. When I first saw him standing out there on the sidewalk, I thought nothing of it. I certainly didn't think he'd still be out there come September. I lingered at the window for just a moment, decided that the night-bound silhouette across the street was just some guy out for a walk, and went to my room and hit the hay. As I stood blearily over the coffee maker the next morning, my eyes strayed up to the window over the sink, and a little shock of adrenaline removed the need for caffeine. He was still there, and still standing on the opposite sidewalk looking at my house. My roommates had all gone to work long ago, so I waited for my coffee, got dressed, and then approached the front door and peered through the peephole. He was still there. I took a deep breath, readied myself for whatever nonsense this was going to entail, and opened the door. His gaze shifted to me as soon as I stepped out onto the porch, and he watched me as I walked across the grass. He tensed when I stepped onto my sidewalk, but then looked relieved when I crossed it and reached the curb. Stopping there, I kept the pavement between us. I didn't know exactly how to ask him what the hell he was doing. Hey, what's up? He looked a little bit nervous. Nothing. Just hanging out. From where I was standing, he didn't appear to be homeless or crazy. He was a man of about 40 dressed in a dark blue robe, and I vaguely recognized him. Don't you live in that house? I pointed up the driveway behind him. He nodded. Yep, that's mine. Just came out to get the newspaper. I glanced down at his hand, where he held an orange bag with the newspaper rolled up inside it. Well, it's like you got it. I paused. Another orange bag was lying further up the driveway, as if the one he was holding was actually yesterday's. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with a masked, nervous expression. Did I see you out here last night too? I asked. Yep, that was me. I looked down further and saw that his feet were bare. You weren't out here all night, were you? I expected him to laugh off the idea, but instead he replied, I was. You've been out here all night in bare feet? Panic was oozing out from under his mask of calm politeness in a dozen different ways. Yes. Now I was starting to feel more than a little weird. Are you going to stand out here all day, too? He strained to speak, but then seemed to change his reply. I might. It's beautiful weather out. Well, that much was true. It was a warm summer day, bright and beautiful. Well, could you at least not stare at my house then? He began to give an apologetic shrug, but stopped halfway through the motion and tried to turn. His bare feet never lifted from the sidewalk. The attempted turn was more of a twist from the thighs up. That, too, stopped rather quickly, and then he said, His gaze moved in a circle before he finally looked directly at me. Your house is nice. I like looking at it. By then I was getting rather annoyed. What's your name? Russ. Russ? Nice to meet you. I shook my head. I'd never had to do this before. If you don't stop being weird and staring at our house, I'm going to call the police. His eyes lit up. Yes, please do that. That was a weird enough reaction that I actually got out my phone. I'd been raised to never involve the police for any reason, but this was abnormal enough that I felt I had to. I told the dispatcher we had a strange man standing outside our house, and that he'd been there literally all night. Yes, all night. She said 2 officers would be with us shortly. Russ, and I didn't talk much while waiting for them. He just stood there looking at me at random times and around the neighborhood otherwise. Ours was a quiet street populated by nice people who kept mostly to themselves. We never even had cause to really meet each other. If we had, I might have known more about Russ, but as things were, he was just some man acting strangely. Although, his aura of masked nervousness calmed as a squad car turned down the lane and approached us. 2 uniformed officers climbed out and approached us with tired stances. One asked dismissively, "What seems to be the issue, gentlemen?" Russ looked at me hopefully. I told them, "This guy's been standing out here staring at our house all night long." The second cop rolled his eyes. "But he did ask Russ, that true, sir?" Russ gulped and stated, "Yes." Both cops straightened at the unexpected answer. The first one asked, "Seriously?" Russ nodded. The second cop looked at each of us for a moment, and then said, "Well, move it along then." Russ tensed and stood a little taller. "No, what?" I said no. As the pair began walking toward him, he added, "Sir." As one got out handcuffs, the other sneered and said, "Listen, asshole." But he stopped about 2 feet from Russ. His partner froze as well. "Come on," Russ urged them. "What are you waiting for? Come on." The 2 men looked at each other with haunted expressions, then began to back away. The handcuffs were returned to their belt. "No," Russ shouted at them. "Do it, you pricks. You pigs. Ugly bastards. Come on, beat me up. Teach me a lesson. Knock me down." The first cop's face was pale. "You're fine, sir. You're absolutely right, we're pigs. Just do what you like. Stand there as long as you want. You're on your property, technically, so this is none of our business." The second glanced at me with apologetic terror. Both jumped in their car and peeled away. Russ screamed incoherently after them, but did not move from his spot on the sidewalk. I called the station a second time to ask what had happened, but after taking my address, the dispatcher told me never to call again and hung up. The anger faded out of Russ as he saw me lower the phone, and I stood there awkwardly as the grown man across the street began to outright cry. I'd never seen a 40-year-old man blubber from sheer, hopeless terror. "Russ, what's going on?" He couldn't answer past his tears. Looking left and right first, I finally stepped onto the street and got near him. I had the strangest notion, but I couldn't articulate it. The words simply wouldn't come to mind. An instinctual awareness was the most I could manage. I did reach the opposite curb right in front of him, and I was intent on pushing him back off of his spot on the sidewalk, but I changed my mind about 2 feet away from him. It would have been weird to touch a crying grown man. I stepped back to the street. Confused, I tried a second time. At 2 feet away from him, literally within arm's reach, I changed my mind again. He could do what he liked. Who was I to interfere if he wanted to stand outside on a beautiful day? Each time I got close and then changed my mind, his tears and terror deepened. I remember murmuring, "All right, screw this," and I backed up to the middle of the street to get space for a running start. I couldn't articulate what I was doing, but I guessed that a leaping tackle might work. I braced myself and then launched forward, ready to spring up at the proper distance. But as I went to jump at him, I changed my mind. There was nothing wrong, and I was being silly. Who cared about any of this? I slowed and curved away. His sobbing became a river. Despite an overwhelming sense that something was very wrong, I turned and slowly went back inside. I could still see him through the kitchen window, and I began going about the business of my day with a muted horror that I could not acknowledge gnawing at my heart. Each time I looked, I would hope against hope that he had moved, but he was always still there, shaking, crying, and looking around for help. That was June. A pall hung over our neighborhood, where once my roommates and I had held board game parties and had a dozen people over. Now we ate meager meals in silence. Whenever one of us would think to talk about something that had happened at work, or perhaps an event we were looking forward to, we would get out half a sentence and then be overwhelmed by a sense of hollowness. Who could care about a concert or a trip to a water park at a time like this? We would stop our sentence midway through and glance out the kitchen window as a group. Always, Russ was still standing there. He successfully avoided dangerous sunburns by lifting his robe over his head during the brightest hours, and he had a few nearby trees to shade him at other times. His bare feet took the worst of it and were red and boiled over after a week. During that second week, we gathered daily as a neighborhood. It was impossible not to have noticed him standing out there by then, and all the various residents of our street wandered out to speak to him and to one another about various polite topics with strained undertones. Terrible weather, a neighbor would say, her eyes fearful. The weather was gorgeous and beautiful. Absolutely terrible weather, another of us would say. Horrifying, in fact. What the hell is happening with the weather? I remember the oldest of us, a woman who had lived through the Great Depression and was normally tough as nails, then cried openly and sobbed, "Why is the weather doing this?" Russ stood through all of this, visibly hopeful and terrified. The old woman screamed at him, "Why don't you just go inside?" He could only shrug and shakily tell her, "I don't want to go inside. I like sunburns on my feet." She approached with both hands up to throttle him, but changed her mind as she came within reach. "You're a man, you can take it. I shouldn't interrupt your enjoyment of nature." She hobbled away in tears, trembling violently. Another of our neighbors stepped forward. "At least take these clothes." He held a folded shirt and a pair of jeans forward, but turned away before getting close enough to hand them over. You probably don't want my old hand-me-downs, right?" Russ replied hopelessly. "I'm fine. Thanks, though." It was the rainy season in our parts, and it began to drizzle on our heads. So we retreated to our homes to gaze out the window and watch Russ thirstily hold open his mouth to the sky. Once the torrent was heavy enough, he could also lean down and scoop water from the flow running along the curb. That gave us an idea. As a neighborhood, we began to wash our cars more often. The runoff from the hoses would flow past Russ, allowing him to drink and stay alive, but only for as long as was normal for washing one's car. None of us mentioned it to one another. We just saw others doing it, so we did it too. The rainy season also brought worms up out of the ground, which he ate, and he learned to stand still long enough for birds to come near. He would grab them and eat them whole. The sidewalk near him became foul with waste until each new rain washed it clean. One of the men on the street began building a long wood and metal contraption. For the first time in a month, we had something else to see outside our windows, and we watched him for nearly a week before getting a sense of what he was doing. It was a massively long Rube Goldberg machine full of levers, swinging hammers, rolling balls, and other assorted nonsense. From the 2x4s he'd laid out, he'd planned for it to extend all the way down the street, around the corner, and out of sight. My roommates and I took a few days off work and wordlessly began helping. The older women in the neighborhood brought out drinks and food for us. Russ looked on while we ate and drank, but he watched especially carefully while we worked. I'd never been one for tools, but I muddled through figuring out how to saw and nail things effectively, and the other men in the neighborhood joined us without a word when they saw how serious we were. It took 6 days, but we finally finished the contraption on the eve of a big storm. As the sky was growing dark, we gathered around the corner out of sight of Russ and stared at the button that would activate the machine. If all the levers and hammers and contraptions worked, Russ would be knocked over by a battering ram mechanism at the very end. We stared at the button. A jogger approached, and we stared at her. She slowed and looked worried that 30-odd people were watching her. We backed up and glanced at the button repeatedly. "You want me to push this?" she asked, cautious but concerned. "Is this for some sort of prank video?" We looked at each other, and the old woman who had survived the Great Depression shrugged and nodded. The jogger moved close and hovered her hand over the button before backing up. "Nah, I'd rather not participate in a prank video." Her expression was fearful and pained. She jogged on as we stood in despair. The storm came and destroyed most of the mechanisms. The man who'd started it took it down in grief-stricken silence over the course of the next week. Russ watched that process with despondent eyes. A moving truck pulled up one morning, and we gathered on the street to watch his wife begin packing things. "Russ lost his job because he stopped showing up," she explained, "and now we can't afford the place anymore." She looked over at him with narrowed eyes and said hatefully, "I don't understand why he's doing this, but I'm not staying with an unemployed loser who would rather stand around all day than do some honest work." "This is honest work," he called over, crying despite his words. "It's tough standing here without rest. I do get tired, but someone has to do it." We watched her put Russ' son in the passenger seat and then drive off with most of the contents of his house. We looked to Russ. He gulped, wiped his tears away, and gave the flimsiest reasoning I'd yet heard. "It's more important that I stand here than go after my family. I didn't value them anyway." He seemed to give up after that, letting the sun sear his flesh day after day, and not even bothering to eat the worms that followed each storm. That was July. The first party our street had seen in months nearly sparked a riot. Our place was one of two on the street designated as off-campus housing, and the other house kicked off a kegger at about 7 o'clock one night. Outrage and anger flowed with us into the foyer of that house. The college guys therein turned down the music and had their friends hang back a second as the entire neighborhood crowded in. The old woman asked, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Having a party," one of the guys responded. "What's the problem?" "We're not being loud." I was actually the one who spoke next. I remember my righteous anger vividly. "How can you have a party while things are the way they are?" One of other guys who lived there protested. "So what? We're supposed to just stop everything and not live our lives because of the way things are." The guests looked at us in confusion. The most painful part about that argument was that the guys were right. We couldn't just stop our lives because of what was happening on our street. The shouts and yells from each side were more about how we felt than any logical debate, and a fistfight broke out just long enough to knock over the keg and break 2 glasses. We held each other back and retreated as a neighborhood, leaving the college guys to their party. I was bitter, so bitter, and we all felt that bitterness together, until another neighbor had a party 2 nights later. A week after that, one of my roommates had our friends over for a board game night, and I had to admit that it felt like such a relief to return to normalcy. At the end of the night, I walked the last of our friends out, had one last joke and a laugh, and then waved after them. Russ was just a silhouette in the darkness, always there, but no longer on our minds all the time. Of course, the next morning the guilt hit me like a load of bricks as I stood over my coffee maker and studied the boil-covered red scarecrow across the street. His blue robes were growing tattered after months outside, and he looked like a burned corpse. Unfortunately, I had a stressful day ahead, and I couldn't afford to process my guilt at that moment. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was the one who did it. I closed the blinds over the kitchen window. It was supposed to have been just for that day, just so I could get through the big project at hand, but the blinds never came back up after that. As a house, as a group, we stopped looking out the window. Just like washing our cars, just like working on that Rube Goldberg machine, and just like our reaction to the party, my neighbors took that as a cue. Within 5 days, all the blinds on all the windows on the entire street were lowered. That first night that Russ was completely alone outside in the dark, with all the blinds closed, an absolute guarantee that nobody was looking out for him or at him. I laid in my bed staring at the ceiling and crying quietly. This was not like the other pains on this street, not like the ones that couldn't be articulated. I knew exactly what I'd done this time, and I could think and say the words since it was my issue and my guilt alone. I was the first one to close the blinds. I wanted to be the first to raise them again, to look out upon our neighborhood problem and force everyone else to open their eyes and unite again, but I didn't have the courage. I needed to work. I needed to pay rent. I couldn't be the one, because raising my blinds would mean acknowledging the problem, and I couldn't afford to be racked by guilt and confusion and pain any longer. Each night, I prayed that someone else would be the first to raise their blinds. Surely someone would do it. It was the only conscientious path, and someone would definitely feel compelled to do the right thing. Then we could all do it together. I put the issue out of my thoughts for so long that I was actually startled when I saw Russ healthier than before, with nobody mowing his lawn or trimming his trees, and with an abnormally rainy season. The greenery around him had grown to shade him nearly the entire day. His skin was back to a decent color where crinkled parchment had peeled off, and a large number of crickets and other bugs had taken up residence in his waist-high lawn. On these, he fed, reaching down to grab insects at random and eat them when the urge struck him. I'd looked because a car had pulled up, and I watched as a real estate lady got out and began pestering him. "Hey," I shouted from across the way, defensive over our issue. "You leave Russ alone. This is ridiculous," she called back. "I need to sell this property, and I'm never going to get a buyer interested in a property with a weathered homeless man standing outside of it. He's not homeless." I shouted at her. "That's his home." "Not anymore. His wife got it in the divorce because he failed to show up to the hearings." I don't know why I said it. I'm at the sidewalk. Somehow, at some unknown point, I'd accepted it as simply the way things were. The real estate lady glared at me, and then at Russ, and then she got in her car and left. I knew what would happen next, and my roommates and I harassed the landscaping crew she sent until they got fed up and left too. If they mowed the lawn and pruned the trees, Russ would be in serious trouble. We congratulated ourselves for a job well done and went back into our house for board game night. That was August. The derisive talk began earlier this month. As the first chill of autumn hit the air, I think people instinctively knew that the worst was yet to come for him. Whenever we happened to glance his way, someone would spit and call him an idiot for standing there like that. "Why doesn't he just go inside?" someone would ask. "Yeah, what a dumbass," someone else would say. I just stared at them when they said things like that. I did wish it would stop, that he would stop, but I don't know. I just don't know. I was prompted to write this and share our situation because I saw it in myself. I saw my feelings turning toward blame and hatred. I asked the same questions. Why was he doing this? Why wouldn't he just go inside? But that strange dread notion that I could not articulate drove me to go outside and do something no one else had done in weeks. Talk to him. "Hey, Russ," I said by way of opening, since I had no idea what else to say. His hair was a mane and his beard was wild, but there was still a man under there. He coughed to clear his throat and then managed to say, "Hey, there was really no beating around the bush. You gave up for a little while there, didn't you?" He nodded weakly. "What changed your mind? Why are you eating and drinking again? Why do you fight so hard to survive?" I asked him, my heart full of compassion. I felt like I was such a great person for caring when nobody else did. I will never forget his bemused, angry laugh. He tilted his head and said, "To stick it to you assholes." That was the one answer I'd never expected. We'd done so much for him, gone through so much guilt and angst and effort. But I guess I'd never thought about what it was like on the other side of the blinds, standing there night after night, knowing the entire neighborhood was avoiding looking at you. I don't have an answer. I don't have any answers. I wanted to tell him good luck, but it would have just sounded hollow. I nodded and went inside. This time, I raised the blinds and stood by the kitchen window. As the first flakes of snow for the season began to fall, I accepted his angry gaze. Would the heat of his hate be enough to keep him warm through the winter? Summer seems impossibly far away, especially without so much as a blanket. And yet all the people who come over, all my friends and roommates and acquaintances, all just keep asking idly, why doesn't he just go inside? If only it were that simple. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.